They are an ancient enemy. They have plagued humankind since the dawn of time, killing untold thousands of people. Their existence is a blight on civilization, with destruction its chief characteristic. Our ancestors battled them well before modern folks captured them with their mobile phones. The earliest writings about tornadoes date all the way back to the year 1054 in eastern China, when the Song dynasty started writing about their destructive and lethal powers. The first recorded photograph of a tornado occurred in the United States way back on April 26 of 1884 in Anderson County, Kansas. A short 4 months later that summer, this rather menacing picture of a twister appeared out of Howard, South Dakota. Now, of course, thanks to the digital age and modern storm chasing, every funnel, every twister, and certainly every violent tornado is photographed and fully captured on video, often from beginning to end, and usually from multiple vantage points. We remember the harrowing images and the lives lost from the Mayfield, Kentucky long track EF4 from a few years ago. We recall the savage photographs and the staggering death toll from the Joplin, Missouri EF5. Prior to that, we remember Parkersburg, Iowa, Greensburg, Kansas, Moore, Oklahoma, and Gerald, Texas. However, before all of these terrible storms was the greatest tornado of all time. This is the story of the legendary Tri-State Tornado. It was March 18th, 1925. While it was a little warm for that time of the year, it was overall a pretty typical early spring day in the heartland of southeast Missouri. While the big cities were thriving with a tech boom and a roaring economy, the nation's midsection had been largely overlooked, and the pain in people's pocketbook was real.
In rural America, the Depression started a lot earlier than it did in the urban centers because the agricultural depression started shortly after the end of the First World War.
Life was especially hard for the farmer.
There was a price collapse for major commodity crops because farmers had overproduced in order to feed Europe at the time. So in the 1920s, rural America had already begun a kind of downward economic spiral. And so things were tough out there, even in the early to mid 1920s, when the cities were still booming and roaring.
Unfortunately for small town rural America, one of the worst natural disasters in world history was about to make life a lot harder.
This storm was orders of magnitude more powerful than anything that we have ever seen.
Oddly enough, it didn't look all that impressive at first. From a meteorological perspective, initially nothing really stood out about the system that would go on to spawn a storm of unparalleled power and destructive force. Research meteorologist Don Burgess, who worked on a recent study of the Great Tri-State Tornado, describes the weather setup from that day 100 years ago.
It was a strong trough. It was a significant low pressure area. There was instability. There was wind shear, but you can't say that it was more significant than the background of other tornado outbreaks.
On the morning of March 18th, 1925, a moderately strong low-pressure system moved from eastern Oklahoma and had positioned itself across southern Missouri by midday, as thunderstorms began to develop along a warm front extending to the east. At approximately 1 o'clock local time, as dark storm clouds gathered over the Ozarks of southeast Missouri, a funnel descended to the ground just north of the town of Ellington, where it took the first of what would become many, many victims. From there, it approached the small mining town of Annapolis, Missouri. Local historian Steve Weingenstien described the scene of the town he was born in.
It was a warm spring day, warmer than usual for that time of year. So everybody was kind of expecting thunderstorms anyway. But then about 1 o'clock, a little shortly after 1, all of a sudden, just what was described as a kind of a black column appeared over the hill just to the southwest of town.
Despite occurring nearly 100 years after the advent of modern photography, somehow, the greatest tornado of them all was never caught on camera.
And I can tell you that early in the tornado's life, it was well visible. It looked looked from the description that they gave us that it was more like a Great Plains tornado where you could see it from a ways away.
However, this tornado was incredibly fast.
And it was on the town and gone before anybody had time to react. It was an incredibly fast-moving storm, and that's one thing that really stuck in people's minds, was how quickly it came and went.
By the time the storm left Annapolis, 3 more had perished. In addition to the blazing speed of the tri-state, locals had another thing going against them at the time.
One of the major things whenever considering this storm is this was in a time before the advent of early warning systems. And so this town and many of the communities that were along this storm's track were absolutely devastated because they had no warning aside from the visual cues.
And these visual cues, unfortunately, would fail most people as the storm grew in size thanks to its unique positioning in an increasingly favorable environment for tornadoes.
Probably what makes this a little more unique was the fact that conditions came together to have this tornado form near the center of the surface low pressure area.
Right.
And it was near the intersection of the warm front and the dry low. And that's a favored location you're probably going to remember.
Next, the storm completely destroyed the town of BLA, taking 4 more victims, with some witnesses observing a second tornado, possibly a satellite or side vortex that merged with the burgeoning tri-state. At this point, it had grown to almost a mile wide and was still moving at a frenzied pace of around 67 miles per hour as it crossed over the Mississippi River and into southern Illinois, where most of the death and destruction would occur. To make matters worse, the storm had radically changed appearance and no longer looked like a recognizable funnel-shaped cloud. The terrible tornado became extremely wide and was concealed by dark shafts of heavy rain and hail. By the time the monster arrived in the tiny river town of Gorham, Illinois, it was over. They didn't see it coming. The town was 100% decimated, over 100 were injured, tragically 37 victims had been claimed, and the onslaught of death and destruction was just beginning.
And what made this such a terrible disaster, in part, is not only that it stayed at exactly the right place to stay strong for so long, but it was so hard to see.
Right.
That we have so many interviews with people who were just amazed that they had no idea it was anything but an ordinary thunderstorm until their houses started blowing up.
At approximately 2:30 p.m. local time, the behemoth had reached the city of Murphysboro, Illinois. Located on a major railway, Murphysboro was an important regional hub for both mining and agricultural interests. At the time, the population was around 15,000 and included many European migrants. One of the more interesting accounts of the tornado's arrival, as reported by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, came from Michael Kiley, an engineer of the M&O passenger train that happened to be traveling north into town when the storm hit. Pauline Gardiner was in class at Murphysboro High School when the storm arrived.
I was a senior that year, and I guess I was sort of prepared for this storm because my mother was just frightened of storms, and I think when you're reared that way, you are more or less anxious about storm.
A low rumble could be heard as the storm approached.
As this rumbling continued, the sky began to get greenish black. And we had cloth shades on the south side, and they began to flop.
Meanwhile, Elsa Rieckenberg was working as a daycare provider across town.
I heard such a terrible loud clash of thunder. And then I went upstairs and I told the lady I was working for, I said, "Oh, Mrs. Whirlwind, there's a storm coming. I just saw that house go over on the hill."
Elsa was taking care of Mrs. Wooden's grandchild.
So the baby was asleep on her bed. Well, she went and threw herself over the baby, and that's what saved her and the baby. And I went into my bedroom, which was in the door next to her bedroom. And of course, they found me between the sidewalk and the highway. And then they took me to the hospital. I had my leg crushed badly. And the next day, they amputated it. And then that following Sunday, they sent me with, I think, 53 other patients to Barnes Hospital in St. Louis. And I was there for 5.5 weeks.
Raymond Schwebel was at recess at Longfellow School when the storm hit.
We were out at recess playing around, and I had a big hat on, and a puff of wind come up and looked bad. We didn't think anything about it, but they called us in, and we were in line marching in. One of the kids flipped my hat up in the air, and the wind caught it, took it down about a half a block. So I ran down and got it, got back in, and just walked in and sat down, and it felt like a steam, cold steam. And you could see the windows give, and the storm hit. And I run back to get underneath the seat so I could protect myself. And there was already 2 or 3 of them in there. And so I started out, and Emmett Fisher was the principal. And he pushed me back, and about that time, Ed Pirro came up. And he was a pretty husky boy, and I was kind of husky. So he made a pass, and Fisher tried to get out, and Fisher pushed him back. And then I made a pass, and he pushed me back. But that time, he had Mr. Fisher off of balance, and Ed run out and went down to the landing. And a piece of timber hit him in the hip, knocked him down. And of course, I went out behind him, and that knocked him down. He stayed there. And I went out the second door, and Mr. Fisher said he saw me go out, but he lost track of me. And about that time, a belfry tumbled down, and he thought I was under it. So he went out in that yard and checked around, and he found me laying out in the gutter of the street. I had a bleeding. I was bleeding all over. And he said that he looked at me and I was dead, as far as he's concerned.
Raymond was fortunate to somehow survive. Unfortunately, though, 14 of his schoolmates at Longfellow weren't so lucky. Meanwhile, back at the high school.
Well, it got so bad that I became so frightened, I got up out of my seat. I was about the third one to get up out of my seat. And the teacher sounded the gavel and wanted us to sit back down. And wouldn't you know, I'd forgotten an apology on my desk, and I went back. Had I not gone back for that, I would have gotten out and not been so crowded. But the last thing I remembered was walking through those swinging doors, and I saw Bernard Shuley, who was killed. And he was the last person I remember seeing, because then it got dark. And then that's the last I remember, because the wall caved in and I was buried. And I think I must have been out for a few seconds or something like that. And I was, my eye was resting on the corner of a brick. And then, of course, I was all covered, and my mouth was pried open. And the sand and gravel and everything, see, it rained very hard, was trickling down into my mouth, and thought, oh my, I'm going to choke. Then close by, I heard this girl praying. Oh, she was praying. And I can't tell you how many minutes we were buried. This seemed a long time, but they were walking on us, you know, and they were grinding these rocks, bricks. So finally we were rescued.
Pauline, like many of her schoolmates at the high school and Longfellow, were trapped in the rubble of brick and mortar buildings that simply could not withstand the ferocious winds. Unbelievably, 34 students and faculty died. Vivian Parrish was a teacher at the elementary school at the time.
I was a second grade teacher.
Recess had just been, and the pupils were all seated in the room in the second grade. A terrible light showed at the blackboard, at the top of the blackboard, and we were getting ready to study spelling. All at once, the windows came in. We had no warning at all that a tornado was coming. We didn't have a television, or we didn't have a radio at school then. Even 2 or 3 minutes earlier, it would have caught all of our children and a number of the teachers out on the playground. Thank the Lord, we were inside.
When Dollie Schwebel arrived home, her sister was missing.
Whenever I got home, my brother-in-law was there and his wife. They lived on 19th and Garside Street, and his wife was gone, and they could not find her nowhere. For 10 days and nights, my dad and my brother-in-law went to all the funeral homes in town hunting my sister that could not be found, thinking maybe she would turn up. So this last day, they went to a funeral home here in town, and they were to bury the body the next day for a man. But she was 6 weeks pregnant, so they did a autopsy on her and found out her arms and legs were burned off, and they found out that it was my sister. So after 10 days, we got to bury her body. And as the storm skipped over into DeSoto, it killed my grandmother. My grandfather had her in his arms, and the tornado sucked her out of his arms and took her in a field in the back of their house, and a 2x4 hit her in the head and killed her.
After suffering such incredible tragedy, like many Murphysboro residents, finding shelter was difficult.
We had 8 people come into a 4-room house where there was already 5 of us to stay until they could get things done for them to get into some kind of shelter somewhere. So we was really crowded, but we were together, and that's what counted.
Joe Meadows also didn't have a home to go back to.
We come home. I remember power line just snapping, part houses burning, a lot of debris on the streets, everything. But we finally got home. All we had was a sub-4 house. Then we moved from after that. Well, we went to my grandparents' house out in the country, and Red Cross had a big tent put up. All our family lived in it.
Most of the town was flattened, and many residents were forced to live in tents or in some cases train cars for weeks afterwards. The devastation in Murphysboro was complete, but the misery wasn't over. Immediately following the passage of the monstrous storm, as if the situation couldn't get any worse, a massive blaze broke out. Claudia Kappell and her family were at home that night as they watched the fire move towards them.
My father's business was on Walnut between 16th and 17th, and it was burned. It was a complete loss. My mother was prepared to take us because she thought that it looked at one time that like it was going to get as far as our home. We didn't have suitcases at that point, so she put some of the necessities into pillowcases, and my sister and I were allowed to select our best doll, and we were prepared to leave. But as it turned out, the fire was stopped at the corner of Walnut and 16th. And it did not come down to where we lived.
A busted gas line and down electrical wires were to blame for the fire that burned all night and part of the next day, exacerbating rescue and relief efforts. It was a worst-case scenario for Murphysboro. Over 1,100 homes and businesses were completely destroyed by the storm. 700 people were hurt, many with permanent injuries, and 234 residents were tragically killed. The staggering death toll remains as the most ever for a single city by a single storm in U.S. history. At this point in the story, I would like to tell you that it was over, but it wasn't. The infamous tri-state tornado didn't even weaken. In fact, many witnesses described the tornado merging with another giant storm cloud to the north. According to reports, it got sucked into the vortex as it moved through the city of Murphysboro. This could very well have been a thunderstorm cell merger, causing the storm to increase in size and probably strength too, just like the infamous Joplin, Missouri EF5 from 2011. Only the difference is the tri-state had already been on the ground for more than an hour and a half at that point and was still growing.
That's maybe the most remarkable thing about this event, is that it was a storm that was just in the proper place with respect to the meteorological environment. It was able to stay there. It was moving very consistently from 250 degrees, that's toward the east-northeast, at about 60 miles per hour.
The giant storm kept mowing down every town in its path, and the mining community of DeSoto was next in line. The storm would go on to destroy a third of DeSoto, and the high school took a direct hit, killing 33 kids, a record for the most students killed at any school by a single storm.
You know, anytime a tornado comes through and disproportionately kills children like it did, it literally leaves a mark.
By the time it had exited DeSoto, another 100 would be injured and a total of 69 were killed. At 3 p.m., still moving at 60 miles per hour, the storm slammed into West Frankfort. This railroad and mining community of around 7,000 residents was fortunate the storm missed the downtown area to the north. Despite this, however, like in Gorham, like in Murphysboro, and also DeSoto, there was no warning. And just like the others, West Frankfort was not spared, with 200 injuries and a gut-wrenching 147 fatalities. The rampage continued to the east, wiping out 90% of the small town of Parrish, Illinois, where it killed 46 in its wake. The town never recovered and never even bothered to rebuild. From there, the monster crossed the Wabash River and immediately began to terrorize its third state of the afternoon, where it completely destroyed the small town of Griffin, Indiana, before laying siege to the south side of Princeton, killing another 45 in the Hoosier state. Mercifully, the storm started losing some of its punch before finally lifting near Petersburg, Indiana at about 4:30 p.m. local time. The legendary tri-state is the worst tornado disaster in U.S. history. A post-analysis of the storm would reveal that it was an EF5 with winds well in excess of 200 miles per hour at many points in its life. The storm would remain on the ground for a record 3.5 hours and would cover an incredible 219 miles. Also a record longest distance ever by a single tornado. Obviously, the lack of a warning system last century was a critical factor to the fate of many who were unlucky enough to be in the path of the tri-state. Princeton, Indiana historian Alan Burr elaborates.
That's the biggest takeaway that I think that I have through all of my research is, what early warning systems can really do for people. It gives people those extra moments to be able to prepare and to take shelter and to make the necessary arrangements.
However, it is important to note that even with modern technology and an advanced warning system, we are still not immune from the ravages of the strongest tornadoes. Lord willing, we will never see a death toll as high as 700 again. However, we don't have to look back that far to realize we are still at risk.
I think Joplin was a wake-up call to a lot of us in the meteorological community. We thought we'd never have a death toll as high as 100 people again.
The Joplin EF5 killed 158 people while injuring more than 1,000, despite only being on the ground for 38 minutes. However, if anything good can come out of a disaster like Joplin or the tri-state, it's that they brought the best out of people and drew communities together.
One of the things that is memorable about the storm was how quickly relief efforts leaped into action. People just immediately leaped to help out. And I guess, if we're looking for good news or heartwarming news that comes out of an event like that is the speed and generosity of the response to the event.
Following the initial rescue and recovery operations, relief poured in immediately from surrounding communities. Thanks to extensive newspaper and radio coverage of the mega disaster, within a couple of days the entire nation was pitching in to help with medical care, food, clothing, donations, and other provisions.
And I think the important lesson to learn from our ancestors back in that time period is no matter how hard our communities are hit, banding together and supporting one another has to be a priority. It has to be a priority. Whenever something like this happens, we have to lift each other up, work together, and rebuild. No matter what kind of tragedy befalls us. I mean, natural disasters like this can hit at a moment's notice. And so it's important that whenever we are suffering through something like this, that we don't overlook the importance of, showing kindness and helping our neighbors.
In the end, we must remain vigilant because you never know when disaster is going to strike again. And you never know when a family member or a neighbor will be in need. And you never know when it's going to be your turn to face that ancient enemy. Reporting on the legendary tri-state tornado, I'm meteorologist Jeremy Kappell.